Mercedes has finally cracked Formula One's ground effect regulations. Or has it? That's the big question heading into the 2024 season after the best pre-season for Mercedes since the rules changed. There have to be doubts given there have been so many false dawns over the past 2 troubled seasons. And as we'll explain in this video, there are some important unanswered questions, even after an encouraging test. But what has changed? Well, as team principal Toto Wolff says, in both 2022 and 2023, testing left Mercedes on the back foot, heading into the first race of the season. But after 3 days of pre-season testing this year, the feeling in the team is dramatically different and far more positive. That's because the Mercedes W15 correlates well with the expectations based on the various simulation tools used to design and develop it, is giving the drivers confidence, and appears to give the team the foundation for development it lacked in previous years. Technical director James Allison calls it definitely a much better born car than the year before. From the start of testing, it was clear the drivers were much happier with the car. George Russell said it is not the diva that it was before. The problem last year was the lack of confidence in the rear end in the medium and high-speed corners, but compared to that, both drivers feel the W15 is more consistent and therefore easier to drive. With that fundamental problem eliminated, this means Mercedes at last has what Lewis Hamilton characterises as a platform it can build on with upgrades this season. While the timesheets carry little weight in testing, the Mercedes was the second fastest car, behind only the Ferraris of Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. More impressive was the Mercedes long-run pace that also put it close to Ferrari, which is expected to be Red Bull's nearest challenger. The car being brisk isn't in itself cause for celebration, but the fact that the Mercedes W15 appears to have put the ill-handling and capricious tendencies of 2022 and 2023 behind it is a big positive. Trackside engineering director Andrew Shovlin is adamant Mercedes has put a number of the handling flaws of last year behind it. If that's correct, then Mercedes should be able to add performance through development and close the gap to Red Bull, provided, that is, there aren't any undetected weaknesses waiting to bite. So what don't we know about the Mercedes W15? Well, while there were some promising long-run signs, it was one of only 2 teams not to complete a full-blown race simulation. The other was troubled Alpine. This means that on top of the usual doubts about engine mode, track conditions, strategies, etc., we still don't really know where Mercedes stacks up. Mercedes also hasn't had time to fettle the car to maximise qualifying pace. As Allison admitted, we've got a bit more work to do on the single laps. That's because the focus was on understanding the new car. In particular, that means the new suspension characteristics after changes designed to improve the mechanical platform. This meant Mercedes was working through some major setup changes during testing. This included the experiments with the level of anti-dive run on the front suspension. Anti-dive increases the resistance of the front suspension to the significant weight shift under braking, preventing compression and keeping the mechanical platform more stable. That's great for the aerodynamics. With anti-dive already increased with the basic geometry, Mercedes also experimented with moving the rear leg of the upper front wishbone into a lower position to add even more. That was a major change, but Mercedes felt it was worth trying in order to gain data to define the optimum way to run the car. Inevitably, that means the team has yet to build a full understanding of this new platform, which means it could yet produce a few surprises. From trackside, the car also didn't look quite as composed as the Red Bull or the Ferrari. While it worked well, there were hints of instability that might well simply be a consequence of a less well-refined setup as Mercedes conducted experiments. But there is the possibility that while this car is much more consistent than last year, it's still giving a little away in this area. The key question is whether Mercedes does have what Wolff calls a good foundation to build on. The early indications are good, but there's always the danger that in such a different car concept, there are unknown problems waiting to cause trouble. It's a case of so far so good for Mercedes, but there's still plenty that could go wrong, even though the signs are positive. And we still don't really know how fast the car is compared to the opposition. Mercedes' happiness is rooted in solving the problems that held it back last year. The trouble is, it has been here before, sort of. Remember when it surprised the world by launching the Mercedes W14 last year? Despite the problems of 2022, it looks similar to the old car with its infamous zero-pod design, and there were reasons for that decision, albeit ones that proved to be based on ultimately flawed logic. As Allison admitted late last year, this was all because Mercedes underestimated the problem with rear-end instability and believed it to be wrapped up in the porpoising and bouncing problems of the year before. As he said of the driver feedback, we were not listening to them telling us they didn't like the turn-in instability. That wasn't because they didn't value what the drivers said, simply that they assumed it would be fixed with porpoising and bouncing troubles eliminated. The warning there is that it is possible to overlook other problems when you have a major weakness. So although the mechanical platform has improved in 2024 with greater rear stability and driver confidence, there's the ever-present risk that some other nastiness might be lurking, waiting to catch Mercedes out. There was no sign of that in testing, but just because you've solved your biggest problem doesn't always mean it will be plain sailing. What's more, Mercedes has to be wary of the false dawns that have punctuated its last 2 seasons. Time and again, it has been tricked into believing a breakthrough has been made. The improved form in Spain in 2022, the victory in Brazil later that year, and its pace in last year's United States Grand Prix before being excluded are just some of the examples of this. Mercedes cannot afford a repeat. Coming back to the 2024 car, how did Mercedes achieve these gains? The answer was major architectural changes. Although the process of fixing the worst vices of its F1 cars began with the upgrade introduced in Monaco last May, that was always limited by the unchangeable aspects of the car, so the gearbox, rear suspension and monocoque. There's now a new chassis, with the cockpit opening moved rearwards 10 cm. That's something Lewis Hamilton called for, although Allison is adamant that being sat too far forward wasn't the reason for the lack of confidence in the rear end that the 7-times world champion felt. The cockpit move was possible partly because the zero pod design had long since been ditched, allowing the side impact structures to be relocated with this year's car. There was also a change to pushrod rear suspension. This is reckoned by most to be the ideal configuration under F1's current regulations, with only Ferrari, and therefore customer Haas, sticking with the pull rod by choice. Williams also has a pull rod configuration, but that's because it has stuck with the 2023 specification Mercedes suspension. For Mercedes, this change opens up greater aerodynamic opportunity at the rear by moving suspension internals to the top of the gearbox, creating more space lower down. As well as the aforementioned increased anti-dive at the front, there's also greater anti-squat at the rear. Again, this serves to stabilise the mechanical platform. This combines with significant aerodynamic changes, including a modified nose that now attaches to the second element of the front wing rather than the main plane, allowing cleaner airflow to the front of the floor. There's also a switch to a more letterbox-shaped cooling inlet in order to create space for a more aggressive undercut as part of an overhaul of the side pods and engine cover shape. While we've raised plenty of questions, and there are things that could yet trip Mercedes up, there is every chance that it really does have the baseline to work from that it needs. But if that's the case, it's unrealistic to expect it to be at the front beating Red Bull immediately. After all, Red Bull hit upon broadly the right car concept from the start of these regulations, and is now in the 3rd year of these cars, while Mercedes has been forced to change direction significantly. The best case scenario for Mercedes was always likely to be that it had a car it could work with and that the fundamental limitations had been removed from. Testing suggested it might have exactly that, provided there are no unpleasant surprises around the corner. As Wolff says, the main objective for Mercedes was to create a consistent and stable platform that reacted as expected and allowed the drivers to push. The objective after that is that the car is one that can develop throughout the year, bringing real-world performance to the track. Has Mercedes achieved all of these objectives? We don't know yet, but it has made a promising start, and that's already a big improvement on both 2022 and 2023.